Good evening. It's a Monday night here in early October, and I would like to try an experiment. A couple weeks ago, I had the privilege of leading a devotional for the ladies on the Wednesday night study for a woman's heart, and it came out of the text from early in the letter that James writes to those churches from verse 17, where it speaks of God as a gift giver, in whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. That's in verse 17. And so I allowed that text to form the substance of a short devotional on a doctrine that has great ancient tradition behind it. And though it is not something we talk about much, it's certainly something that's rather pivotal in our thinking about God. And that was the doctrine, or that is the doctrine known as impassibility. And what I want to do now is, at the very least, give a very short overview of what that doctrine means. But then I'm actually got some of your questions that you submitted following that devotional, that you felt like were pretty important, and as I've looked over them, are pretty important too. So we're going to use this as an opportunity to imagine this format, this medium, as a means by which we could share or walk through questions and offer some answers that might be on people's minds, whether it comes in a small teaching event like that, or maybe even following sermons. We'll see. Depending on the response, we'll see if this is something we want to continue and develop over time at Grace Mills River. The doctrine of impassibility, simply stated, is the idea, it speaks to God's nature. And that doctrine says that God is not one who suffers. And likewise, God is also not one who can have any external force acting upon him to provoke a certain response. And that specifically refers to his emotions or his inner life. And so the word impassibility has the idea of passion contained in its word. And passion is a word that you and I are very familiar with, because we respond in very passionate ways to any number of things that come from the outside, or of thoughts that we've had, or experiences that we've undergone, or even memories that we conjure up. We all know very much about passions. And so when it comes, though, to talking about God, as we search the scripture and we reflect upon what's been said, and we listen to the sages of both near and ancient times, this doctrine has split out, and it's an idea that we've had to wrestle with for a long time. So tonight we're just going to talk briefly about what that doctrine is, and then answer some of your questions that have come in response. As I said, the doctrine means just simply God doesn't suffer. You can't hold him down. You can't make him hurt. You can't do anything that causes him to writhe in any sense of the way. And also, what goes along with that is the idea that there is no action that anything can happen in his creation, or anything that humanity can do, that forces a certain response from him. Nothing that he does is forced upon him from beyond him. Anything that he does is entirely a function of his own prerogative and his own will. So in that sense, God is to be thought of in a way that's in some ways familiar to us, and in other ways entirely unfamiliar to us. The biggest objection that people have to that notion is, don't we see quite clearly and unambiguously in scripture references to the way God responds to certain situations with language that is very familiar in the way of emotions, like words like anger and jealousy and delight, things like that? Don't those suggest that this doctrine of impassibility is probably ill thought, or maybe more like Spock than it is like God, one who is incapable of showing emotion, or unwilling to do so? And the long and the short of the answer to that question, given the nature of Scripture, is that the Bible represents the best words that we have to declare and describe who God is. And it certainly uses language that we're familiar with, because it's language that we express. We are familiar with jealousy. We are familiar with anger. And yet we have to respect the nature of language as having certain limitations to describe who God is. Uh, Given the fact that everything that is attributable to his will and to his work, we might want to hold loosely any of the language that the scripture uses to identify the essence of his being. And so while it's not improper or entirely misleading to speak of God as one who exhibits jealousy or anger, we ought not think that his version of that, or even our attempt to explain that or describe that, is exactly like what we know it as humans. Um, our versions of jealousy are usually provoked in senses of insecurity or a kind of unbridled emotion that we can't kind of rein in, and we would probably be it's both unrealistic and improper to project upon who God is the fullness of what we experience when we speak of those emotions. But nevertheless, the language you find in Scripture is analogical. It has a lot of analogies to it. It is descriptive and it is helpful. It gets us on our way. But like they say, you don't want to make some language walk on all fours and insist that it means the fullness of what we mean. So, yes, the Old Testament is quite clear about the way in which God has expressed himself to the way Israel has responded or other nations have responded, but we have to be careful about ascribing to God exactly what we mean by those words when we ourselves have felt them. The other objection that's raised, as I mentioned that night during the devotional, is that, well, what about Jesus? If there were ever an example of someone who was responding to certain situations with the utmost passion and at times indignation, it's certainly Jesus. In a number of places, even though his emotional life is in many ways spoken of with a measure of restraint. We don't hear much about him. We hear what he says, we hear what he does, but in terms of his inner life, his emotional life, the scripture is more modest in speaking of that, such that when we do hear, or when we do read texts that speak of his inner life, we certainly perk our ears up and listen with great care as to what it reveals. But in reflection upon those texts that speak of Jesus as one who would exhibit great anger at the way, for instance, the Pharisees respond to him healing a man on the Sabbath, or the way Jesus weeps before the tomb of Lazarus in John chapter 11, as those who have reflected on those passages and reflect upon Jesus as both fully God and fully man have argued, it is to be sure Jesus really felt what he felt. Those were not, he was not trying to give a false impression as to what he was really feeling. He was really feeling that. And yet, Jesus himself, being fully God and fully man, we would say that what he was feeling was a function of his human nature, but not of his divine nature. Jesus really did suffer in his humanity, but you can't say that his divinity was that which suffered, died, bled, and died. The idea of the one who is responsible for the existence of all things and in whom everything is held together, the idea that that divinity would suddenly be snuffed out is probably a bridge too far in trying to understand what we mean by God as, or what by Jesus as possessing a divine nature. So the long and the short of it, just to refrain or review, is that God in his nature is not one who undergoes the kinds of suffering that you and I are very familiar with, and unfortunately, in many ways, too familiar with. And furthermore, he is not one who responds, or rather is provoked by that which comes from outside him. His inner life is not such that he must respond in a certain way given to what comes from outside of him. What he intends is constant. It is not like a sine wave of emotions on his part. And so when it speaks of, just as an example, when it speaks of his jealousy, you and I, when we understand jealousy, we know of it as suddenly feeling forced to defend something that we feel like we're losing out on, or that we feel like is being defrauded. We're being defrauded of that thing. And so we're provoked into this very jealous, maybe even rage at what we feel like is being threatened. And yet that would suggest that there's a kind of intensity to our love that at other times is not having to be expressed. And the the church fathers and other theologians over the time would just say that God's emotional life is that which is rather steady and constant, that his love does not fluctuate as ours does. It is not degraded for any instance, and therefore it does not have to spike in order to act in the way that he would intend. It's just as it is. It's a constant thing. Okay, so I know we could probably go further and longer. One article that I might heartily recommend to you that I think encapsulates the nature of this doctrine, the outline of the doctrine really well, is something that a pastor over in Charlotte named Kevin DeYoung wrote several years ago. The name of the article is "'Tis Mystery All, the Immortal Dies." And if I can figure out how to use this technology and put up on the screen the link to where you can find that article, he does a great job of outlining both the contours of the doctrine as well as identifying why it's actually good news to believe that God is in fact impassible, that God in his divinity does not suffer. And just as a preview for what you might hear or what you would read in that article if you pick it up, is that the incarnation, the idea that God actually becomes man in Jesus, if we believe that God in his divinity can suffer and that he can feel all that he feels, that we feel, then there's something about the incarnation that's not quite as remarkable as we might otherwise think, because it's in that incarnation where we would say that God takes on flesh. God becomes a human, and therefore he comes to an understanding of ours that if he were already like that, then there's nothing that he really has learned by entering into that form. And so on that count, it's the doctrine of impassibility that underscores just the real magnificence of what it means to say that God became flesh in the person of Jesus. And Kevin DeYoung does a great job of outlining why that is that is the case. The other reason why we might consider the doctrine of impassibility something really to grapple with, and why we might want to love as he loves, if we're honest with ourselves, our love is more tied to any number of things, and it's subject to any number of circumstances. Not only the condition of our own hearts, but the condition of our own circumstances, our own even physical frame is affected or affects our ability to love in any given circumstance. And therefore, why the doctrine of impassibility is so remarkable is because in tandem with our belief that at the time in which we become like God is, in which we see him face to face, in which we are entering into glorified bodies, and I know we're getting into that aspect of theology that is just beyond our minds and sounds more like a Spielberg film than it is like anything that we can reckon with. The idea of a glorified body that we might all have, one in which it is no longer subject to decay, that speaks of a particular condition that we will all experience, in which we are then incapable of sinning, in which sin is no longer of either any interest to us or any allure. Whereas right now, the nature of sin is such that we can be seduced by what it offers, only to discover that it's not quite the satisfaction that it gives the impression of. And so right now we are subject to all manner of passions that we can look forward to a day in which that is not our existence. And therefore a glorified body would speak of us exhibiting some of the same conditions as we would speak of in the way of the Lord. And so our own capacity for being affected by that which comes from outside of us, that's something we can look forward to, that would no longer be the case in time. And so that doctrine of who we speak of referencing to God has everything to do with how we think of ourselves. All right, several minutes, too many minutes into giving an overview of the doctrine that Kevin DeYoung will do a much better job of summarizing. But let me get to the questions that came from what you had to say. And one of them was, how does impassibility affect our prayers? If God is one who is not affected inwardly by what comes from outside of him, does that mean then that God's prayers kind of hit him like a rubber ball off of a brick wall, that he's unaffected by that? And the short answer is no. Our prayer life is not affected by grappling or wrestling or even embracing the idea of the doctrine of impassibility. Clearly, Jesus makes it unequivocal that prayer is not a facade. It's not a ruse. It's not just something we put ourselves through for no good reason. He himself prays. He himself asks. He himself glories in the way God responds to his prayers. And so it is not the same thing to say that if God's emotional life is steady and unflinching, and that his love is constant and steadfast, it's not the same thing as to say that he's unresponsive to the invitations from his people to ask of him both generous and bold things. So the doctrine, whereas it can give the impression that God is very much like a stoic and one who is unmoved or unresponsive, that represents going beyond the scope of what the doctrine of impassibility is out to teach. Our prayers are invited, they're demonstrated, they're exemplified in Old and the New Testament. And so by no means, if anything, it's good news for us in our prayer life when it comes to God's doctrine of impassibility, because he never flags in zeal and his willingness to listen. There's never an exasperation on his part to hear from us. There's never a wearisomeness that he undergoes should we pepper him with frequent but brief prayers, as some of the church fathers would encourage us to offer. So in that sense, prayer is all the more encouraged if we know that there is no sense in which God would ever tire of hearing from us, or of ever having his hands bound or his will curtailed because of anything that comes from outside of him. So in that sense, our prayers are heartily encouraged, and perhaps even enhanced, if you will, in order to address him with every opportunity that we have. Secondly, I've kind of answered this question already in my outline early on. In the Old Testament, God describes himself as angry and jealous often. Men talk to God to save other men and cities from God's anger, to destroy them from the sinners against him. And again, the language that the Old Testament is unafraid to use is language that we're familiar with. And therefore, we respect that language. We learn something from that language. It doesn't mislead us in our understanding of God. But in the same way that Scripture will sometimes refer to God metaphorically as having wings or feathers, there's a limit at which we take the language at its face value and say, oh, clearly, well, if God has feathers and wings, then he must be a bird. And none of us would argue that that's what Scripture is out to teach. But it is out to use language that we're familiar with in order to at least grab hold of something that we can sink our teeth into, and to understand God in at least ways apart from which we have nothing else within our own imaginations to conceive of who he is. So it does speak clearly about an anger or a jealousy, but if you'll think of God's love as this constant thing, then the way in which he acts, anger, as we've talked before in previous sermon series, even most recently in the Proverbs, anger is nothing more than having the desire to defend that which is of value to you. And if God's love is constant and his interest in Israel's welfare is a constant, and there's no sense in which it fluctuates, then in speaking of anger of God, it's just his way of continually defending his interests in their good well-being and in those who are his. And it just comes across in a way that has, to us, a sense of intensity, but in which God's sense has never changed. He isn't one who is provoked, because it is not anything in him that he doesn't require anything beyond him in order to desire what he wants. It's always something that he desires, and therefore that love remains constant in all things. Third question: what are the possible consequences of a believer not holding to the doctrine of impassibility? Do you have to hold to the doctrine of impassibility in order to have a rich prayer life? Which you've already answered. It's if anything, the doctrine of impassibility encourages a prayer life more than discourages it. But is there any sense in which, if you think that the emotional life that we have is more akin to the emotional life that God has, does that compromise anything in our ability to understand who God is or to relate to him in any significant way? To be quite honest, as I conceded when I gave that devotional a few weeks ago, it's not a doctrine I've given much thought to in a lot of years. had heard about it in seminary, but hadn't read much about it until we studied the book of James. Had no reason to. So was my pilgrimage, was my ability to trust in God's lordship or his love compromised by not being able to meditate upon this idea of the doctrine of impassibility? No. Do I respect it more now, though, that I've read about it? Do I think of God a little bit differently now as a consequence of grappling with the idea that his love is like this and it's always steady? I'll tell you one way why I find it to be a comforting thought, and that is, if his love is like this, then even when I fail him, that love does not, it doesn't, it's not lost. It remains constant. Even if he should, in the act of discipline, that's an expression of love. It's not like on an EKG that goes through a diastolic and systolic bump. It's this constant. Not that God's love is flatlining, but that it's just constant, and therefore the expression of discipline as well as the expression of delight is just who he is. It's the nature of what he does, and I find that to be a kind of comfort when I think about it long enough. In that, if there's nothing that I can do to make him love me more, and nothing that I can do to make him love me less, that both reminds me of his nature and helps me to grapple even when the moments when I find myself astray and wondering if that love is in fact is constant. So it's the doctrine of impassibility that helps me to know, even in ways that I displease him, his love remains constant, and that I find a rationale for in believing in the doctrine of impassibility. That's just one reason why I think it has both credibility and consolation, and why I think it's worth anybody at least meditating upon a little bit longer. We want to believe that God is in fact sympathetic to us, and it's not as if the doctrine of impassibility compromises the idea that his love for us isn't true or genuine. But I would say that it is proper to believe that that sympathy is in fact always intact and always steady as a consequence of holding to this doctrine. Which leads me to the last question that's presented here, and that's why do you think it may be difficult for Christians today to believe in the doctrine of impassibility? And I think, quite honestly, it's because we want to have a sense that we can relate to God in a way that is familiar to us, and we know ourselves pretty decently, and we want to believe that God relates to us in a certain way, that he really understands us. And surely we see evidence of the way in which Jesus relates to us. He knows our pain. He knows we are frail, that we are but dust. He certainly is sorrowful before the existence of death, if not rather indignant and stirred up in his spirit, as we see him there before Lazarus's tomb in John 11. And so we might find it difficult to think of Jesus as having those two discrete natures in himself, the nature of his humanity and the nature of his divinity. And therefore we think that if we allow to think of ourselves as, or to think of God as impassible, that therefore not able to think of God as one who is sympathetic to us. But clearly we see that sympathy in Jesus. We just don't have to allow the sympathy and the emotions that we find in him in his human nature to extend to his divine nature. So I would say that's where we are forced to wrestle, not only with this doctrine of impassibility, but with the very doctrine of him having both being fully God and fully man in the same person, two natures unmixed in one person, fully integrated as a single individual, but who is both one prone to suffer in his humanity, but not prone to suffer in his divinity. So I think that's why it will require maybe that you read some more or think about it more, or send in more questions about this before the doctrine of impassibility even makes any sense, much less has any relevance for how we think of God. So those are some of the questions that have come out. This is my first attempt at trying to offer some off-the-cuff answers to some pretty important questions, and we'll see by what people say in response to this vehicle for getting across information, and offering responses to some of the things that come up either in classes or in sermons. We'll see if that works, and if so, we'll continue it. But thanks for sitting in for about 25 minutes, and I hope it's a benefit not only to you but to the whole church. Good night.